No, they have been completely dishonest in their take on him, and for that matter, completely dishonest in their take on Tulsi. Which brings me to my next guest, Caleb Maupin. Caleb Maupin is a speaker, writer, journalist, political analyst, and author. Easily one of my favorite people to talk to. How you doing, Caleb? You doing all right this morning?
Good. I'm great. Can you hear me? Are you
Yes.
getting audio?
Yeah, okay. I can hear you perfectly fine. I have been deeply bothered by, for one, let me say it this way. Tulsi Gabbard did a damn good job at her commencement hearing. And, it makes it clear why they dislike her so much. When they ask her a question, and Tulsi Gabbard answers the question directly. In fact, I'll just give an example. So Tulsi Gabbard points out, I'll go to this one, because there's a few of these, and many of these are really, really good. All right. So this one, where Tulsi Gabbard brings up Timber Sycamore, that the CIA Obama administration was effectively trying to overthrow the Syrian government. And, the response is not, oh my God, we're backing terrorists. The response is, yeah.
They did it in public. They did it at the United Nations.
So this is Mark Kelly, astronaut, who doesn't seem to take issue with, in fact, let me move over to Tulsi answer it because this one is getting a little bit long. He asked this question effectively saying, well, Tulsi, it sounds like you were repeating stuff from Putin and from Assad. Now, Gabbard points out, look, I was fighting in this war, and we were backing terrorists trying to overthrow the government of Syria. Why is this okay? Meaning, if I am literally putting my life on the line for this country to fight Islamic terrorists, as she would call it, then why are we also backing those terrorists in regards to overthrowing this government? This is Gabbard
making these claims.
Senator, as someone who enlisted in the military specifically because of Al-Qaeda's terrorist attack on 9/11 and committing myself and my life to doing what I could to defeat these terrorists, it was shocking and a betrayal to me and every person who was killed on 9/11, their families and my brothers and sisters in uniform. When, as a member of Congress, I learned about President Obama's dual programs that he had begun really to overthrow the regime of Syria, and being willing to, through the CIA's Timber Sycamore program that has now been made public, of working with and arming and equipping Al-Qaeda in an effort to overthrow that regime, starting yet another regime change war in the Middle East. DoD train and equip program, again, begun under President Obama, is widely been known, looked at, and studied, that ultimately resulted in over $500 million being used to train who they called moderate rebels, but were actually fighters working with and aligned with Al-Qaeda's affiliate on the ground in Syria, all to move forward with their regime change and not acknowledging what was obvious at the time and what has unfortunately borne true, which was that a regime change war in Syria, much like the regime change wars in Iraq, the toppling of Gaddafi and Mubarak, while these are all dictators, would likely result in the rise of Islamist extremists like Al-Qaeda taking power. I shed no tears for the fall of the Assad regime, but today we have an Islamist extremist who is now in charge of Syria, as I said, who danced on the streets to celebrate the 9/11 attack, who ruled over Idlib with an Islamist extremist governance, and who has already begun to persecute and kill and arrest religious minorities like Christians in Syria.
I understand.
Why that should be acceptable to anyone is beyond me.
It shouldn't
is
be.
certainly
and
not
I understand,
in our
and I appreciate your answer, and thank you. My concern has to do with the tendency to repeat Russian and Syrian, and even in some cases, I think we'll get into in the closed session, Iranian information.
That is astonishing. That is an astonishing clip. Like the idea that he asks her a question, she responds to it and says, look, we are backing terrorists. They're literally trying to overthrow the government of this country. Obama was doing it. Timber Sycamore. Like, she goes through it. Everything that she said is correct. In fact, just to make that point clear, The New York Times ran with the story a while ago. So this is not even something that is, up for debate. This is literally true. And his response is like, yeah, I get all that. But, it's the fact that you said it. It's like, what? So me repeating something that's true and that I find to be completely detestable, considering that I was fighting for this country, that's your issue, not the fact that we were doing it? That is outrageous. Give me your take on this, Caleb. I was stunned. I can't say I was astonished by it. Disheartened by it is probably the better word for it.
Well, that is kind of the way that they have trained a layer of people to think. You don't think about whether or not something is true. You think about whether or not it sounds like something that someone you have been told is bad might say, right?
Yeah.
If you hear a fact, is this something that Putin might say? Is this something that Russian propaganda might say? Is this something that an anti-vaxxer might say? Is this something that a conspiracy theorist might say? Well, the question should be, is it true or not? I mean, Adolf Hitler was a horrible, horrible person, but I can guarantee you that at least one point in his life, he said something true, and it didn't stop becoming true because Hitler said it, right? And that someone can be awful and say something true. This is a complete logical fallacy. And this is really the way they train people to think on the right during the Cold War, right? Does that sound like what a communist would say? That was the way that they talked, right? And that's why they pushed free market policies. Oh, you got to be completely deregulating free market, because if you're talking about the rights of the workers, or you're talking about union protections, that's what a communist might say. So you got to oppose it. Oh, you got to support the U.S. sending troops to Vietnam. Why? Well, if you're against it, that sounds like what a communist might say. This is the right wing kind of, it's now the left, the liberals, that have taken on the mindset of the McCarthyite right wing, the conservatives from the Cold War era. That's really what I'm hearing there. I was in the room, I will add. It was really great to be there in the room and to see. I mean, there was a huge line of people who wanted to get in, all of them supporters of Tulsi Gabbard. She has a lot of people that are really counting on her. So, it was really great to be there in the room in D.C. I'm still kind of recovering from my trip. I just got back late last night, but I'm glad to be here with you now. So there you go.
No, man, I appreciate it. And you're absolutely right. It is a very bizarre thing. It's like Hitler likes dogs. So if you liked dogs, then you might be something like Hitler. It's like, okay, this is nonsense. Is it true or is it false? And, just because if Russia says, well, you guys are trying to overthrow the Syrian government, they were trying to overthrow the Syrian government, and they eventually accomplished the objective of trying to overthrow the Syrian government. Where's the lie in all of this? And, it's pretty astonishing for Kelly to be like, yeah, I get all that. Meaning he's not contesting anything that she said is false. I mean, it's not like she said, well, that's not true. Well, he didn't say that. He accepts what she's saying is because what she's saying is true. It's understood to be true at this point. His issue was that she said it. And you think to yourself, how many other people know what is true, but they just won't say it? Because from their point of view, well, this is just U.S. policy, and this is just what we need to do in regards to U.S. policy. If I'm not mistaken, later on, he even points out, yeah, but, I just wonder what you are saying in the context, basically, as opposed to what our own intelligence services are saying. It's like you're repeating stuff that these other groups that we don't like are saying, as opposed to listening more to our intel services. The same intel that was trying to overthrow the government of those countries, like just outrageous stuff. What was your experience when you were there? What sense did you get from the people as she was giving this testimony? Were they applauding?
Because it was quite a diverse group of people who turned out. I saw people from the Code Pink organization that are very dedicated to peace. They raise peace on Capitol Hill. They disrupt proceedings sometimes, and they're very, very outspoken in favor of peace. I also saw people from the Hindu American community, and that Tulsi Gabbard, she is of Hindu faith. And she addressed that in her opening remarks, and that there are many Hindu Americans who support her, and they don't appreciate that her religious beliefs have been used against her, right? And they've tried to allege that she's tied to the Indian government, or that she's somehow, because she has these religious beliefs, that's makes her unqualified for office. She spoke to that in her opening remarks very poetically. I saw a lot of military people there who were there to support her. There was actually supposed to be a press conference with Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard and military and veterans and law enforcement. They ended up calling it off probably because of the incident, the aircraft, crash that took place. So they didn't end up having the press conference. I actually went to DC for that press conference. So I ended up just going to the hearings, and it was a big crew of people there to support the Congresswoman there. And, they had about 50 seats, and there was a big line, and it was just, next seat. And then someone would walk out, and then they'd say, all right, we'll take one more. And then you'd go and fill in their seat. And it was standing room only, as they say, but I guess you couldn't stand because they don't allow that. So it was all the seats were full, to put it mildly. But a lot of people there supporting her. When she walked in, people were applauding, chanting USA, USA. I will say, I think that the clothing that she wore all white. You'll notice that was to make a statement. White is a color associated with peace. It's associated with purity in a lot of religious cultures and religious symbolism. And I think the fact that she showed up in all white, I don't think that was an accident by any means. That was very much intended to make a statement. We shall see. She did address in her opening remarks the politicization and the partisanship of the intelligence community. And that is quite a powerful word. She comes out of the Pentagon, let's remember, right? She's a military, U.S. Armed Forces individual. And that there is a long-standing rivalry between the military-industrial complex and the CIA and the intelligence apparatus. And they kind of struggle, with each other. And that you can very much view Obama, who she spent a lot of her remarks criticizing. Obama was very much a product of the intelligence apparatus. Zbigniew Brzezinski, who started the Cold War University, the Center for Communist Studies at Columbia University. That's where Obama was trained. And that Obama was very much a product of the Brzezinski school of geostrategic thinking that kind of defined his administration and is responsible for the George Soros color revolution apparatus and this really obsessive anti-Russian perspective, this focus on color revolutions and overthrowing governments that might get in the way of the United States, destabilizing them, using Islamic extremists as proxies to destabilize governments. This is all Brzezinski, and this is all the Rockefeller think tanks, and this is the Columbia University Geostrategic Center. This is the intelligence apparatus. Whereas there's a lot of people in the military that are like, look, we've run the scenario. If we go to war with Russia, we go to war with China, we don't win. Nukes go off and a lot of people die. So let's think in a lot more pragmatic and realistic terms about these things. Whereas, people compare Brzezinski to Dr. Strangelove in the old Stanley Kubrick movie, right? It's just kind of this mad, obsessive anti-Russian nut who just spent his whole life, he wrote a book called The Grand Chessboard after the fall of the Soviet Union about making sure Russia didn't reemerge and have its strength. So I think that's the deep state rivalry we're seeing. There are just a lot of pragmatic thinkers in the military who have seen that the policies of the intelligence apparatus are just nuts. And instead, they are thinking in a much more pragmatic way.
Yeah. How would I say? How I stopped worrying and started to love the bomb or something to that effect. Yeah. All right. So this is the other one for Snowden. Oh, by the way, one of the other wild part about this too that I love about her, where she points out, and this was something that Donald Trump repeated over and over on the campaign trail, effectively that these wars have done nothing for us. We spent trillions of dollars. Like if you just take Iraq and Afghanistan by itself, $10 trillion. And it's like, what do we have to show for it? Nothing. I mean, short of getting all of these people killed, it is just money that we just wasted. And then if you think of who ended up in power after that, like all of these things have been for naught. And so when she makes that argument is right. And it doesn't necessarily seem like they took issue with what she's saying as being true or false, because they can't really contest that. That's not really their issue. Their issue is that she enunciates it. It's like the fact that she says it is the issue. And they bring up the same thing with Snowden. So she points out over and over and over again, and I think Snowden even responded to this, like, dude, it's been 12 years. Give it a break. They asked her about Snowden, and under no circumstances, she would point out, look, he broke the law. By the same token, the U.S. government was also breaking the law. And Snowden revealed much of the criminal activities of the U.S. government, especially in regards to spying on the U.S. citizenry. And so this is another Democrat asking her a question to go after her. Just
Do you still think Edward Snowden is brave?
Mr. Vice Chairman, Edward Snowden broke the law. I do not agree with or support with all of the information and intelligence that he released, nor the way in which he did it. There would have been opportunities for him to come to you on this committee or seek out the IG to release that information. The fact is, he also, even as he broke the law, released information that exposed egregious, illegal, and unconstitutional programs that are happening within our government.
Excuse me,
that
Gabbard.
led to serious reforms that Congress undertook.
Chairman, we got 5 minutes. So I take your answer, and these are your quotes. Brave, please join my bipartisan legislation calling for charges to be dropped against him. Do you disagree that legislation was not appropriate? Do you believe he is brave or not?
Yeah,
Back those words?
once again, Senator, Edward Snowden broke the law. He
Ms. Gabbard,
also
I'm not
released
talking- we
information
agree that Edward Snowden
that
broke the law.
exposed the United States
Asking you a
government's
question whether
illegal
your
programs.
legislation and your words are still your beliefs. Yes or no, please.
I'm making myself very clear. Edward
Ma'am.
Snowden broke the law. He released information about the United States
Ma'am, I've
government's
got other issues to
illegal
raise. Ma'am,
activities.
I
If I may just finish my thoughts, Senator. In this role that I've been nominated for, if confirmed as Director of National Intelligence, I will be responsible for protecting our nation's secrets. And I have
Ma'am,
4 immediate
ask
steps
for
that I
additional
would
time,
take to
Chairman.
prevent another Snowden-like leak.
ma'am,
You know what's wild about this too? It's a bit ludicrous that if Snowden would have went to any of these people, that they would have done anything about it. Like, and I think this kind of confirmation hearing makes it that much clearer that they wouldn't have done anything about it. Like the very fact that Tulsi Gabbard points out, look, man, we're supporting terrorists. This is outrageous. And they're like, yeah, but you need to shut up about that. And she's like, well, if Snowden should have went to somebody on one of these committees in order to explain what was taking place, and what did you think was going to happen after that? Do they really believe that these committees that are supposed to be overseeing the intel community, who knows what the intel community is doing, by the way, and don't do anything about it, would do something about it if Snowden revealed what they were doing? I think that's ludicrous. But give me your take on that. I mean, give me your take on that.
Well, the fact that she refused to call him a traitor, I think, is a very good sign, because they wanted her to say that, and they just demanded that she call him a traitor to the country. And she refused to do that. She did insist that he shouldn't have done what he did, which, I mean, that makes sense. Being the Director of National Intelligence, you can't be advocate that people leak classified information. And that he did break the law, et cetera. But she didn't. She wouldn't call him a traitor, and she just wouldn't do that. She held her ground on that point. And that is a very, very important sign. That is a message, I think, that she's sending to people around the world who do appreciate what Edward Snowden did. You know, she can't necessarily come out swinging about, oh, he's an amazing person, like she once did, right? She has to kind of back away from her previous words. But when they're demanding that she just completely call him a traitor, she's not going to do that, right? A traitor to the country, you know, treason is a crime punishable by death, according to the Constitution. And, you know, and she comes out of the military. If someone's a traitor, they're the enemy of the country. She wasn't going to say that. You know, she just wasn't willing to call him a traitor to the country. And that's making clear that if she does come in, she's not going to come in as an ally of the people that Edward Snowden exposed for their illegal activities. She's going to come in as somebody who's going to some degree or other, try to restrain them. You know, look, and this is one thing I do want to point out is that, you know, there is, you know, on the internet and among people who share the perspective that you and I have, critical of U.S. foreign policy, there's a lot of people that they hear various things that she said and they're disappointed. They don't agree. And so they just say, oh, it's all hopeless. I don't think it's all hopeless, right?
I think she did fantastic.
Yeah, and that, I mean, she supports Israel. Well, I don't support Israel. That's not good. Her position on the FISA issue has changed. But I'm telling you, the fact that she wouldn't call Edward Snowden a traitor, and it got much more heated. I don't know if you have the other footage, but that guy got really, really fired up. The senator got really fired up against her. Why can't you call him a traitor? This is a yes or no question. You have to be able to call him a traitor. She just wouldn't do it. That's big. That's a huge thing. Isn't it amazing that we could potentially have a director of national intelligence who is somebody who doesn't think Edward Snowden is a traitor to the country? Now, the position that she's going for was created after 9/11. And this is very interesting. So, most countries, they have one intelligence service that is domestic. It's like their domestic, top cops, secret police or whatever. And they're international, right? In Russia, you have the FSB. In China, they have their intelligence services. I think it's just called the intelligence services, right? But in America, we have the CIA, the FBI, we have the U.S. Army intelligence, U.S. Navy intelligence, U.S. Coast Guard intelligence. We have the Secret Service. We have the National Security Agency. And they've created so many of these different agencies, right, that are all kind of supposed to be doing the same thing. And they're all competing with each other for budgets, mainly from the executive branch of the government, right? It's the president who ultimately determines how the money is appropriated, right? So they're all kind of competing for the same budget. They're all kind of doing the same job, which is carrying out intelligence operations, gathering information, trying to roll back foreign influence, trying to, maneuver and manipulate against different entities. And they're all tied in with private corporations as well, right? And especially in the computer age, they don't have computer guys running these agencies. They all contract it out to different computer companies and different people. So at this point, right, they talk about what they call deep state overlap, where it's almost totally confusing. So after 9/11, there was an attempt to deal with the fact that there were so many different intelligence agencies. They created the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. And that was a position created so there'd be one person whose job it was to kind of be the top dog, the top boss of all the intel agencies. And the main thing that the Director of National Intelligence does is brief the president. They prepare a daily briefing for the president of the United States with all the information. They present to the president, this is what's going on. This is the classified information that we've gathered. This is what's happening in the world. And based on that, the president makes a decision. Well, Tulsi Gabbard could potentially be the person who every day gathers information for Donald Trump and presents him and explains to him what's happening in the world. And the idea that it's somebody who doesn't think Edward Snowden's a traitor, who was not happy about us arming terrorists in Syria, who spoke out, and this came up, who opposed the killing of Qasem Soleimani. That's a really big deal. And I think that's potentially a very, very good thing to have her briefing the president of the United States every day. She also criticized the fact that it seemed like other intelligence directors weren't doing their job, and that often the briefings that President Trump got in his previous term were just stuff that you would have read in the New York Times. It was just kind of a summary of the daily newspaper, and that's not the job of the intelligence director. He's supposed to, he or she, who is the director of national intelligence, is supposed to give special information to the president so he has a real understanding of what's actually happening. This is very exciting.
No, that 1,000% agree with you. 1,000% agree with you. I take issue with this traitor stuff because, for one, they were committing crimes against the U.S. government, meaning the U.S. government was committing crimes against the U.S. population itself. The spying was against us. So this idea that she's being a traitor to the country, or Snowden was being a traitor to the country, Snowden was effectively going the higher road in this. And he was brave in coming out with it. And, I don't believe for one moment that if Snowden would have revealed that stuff, under normal circumstances, unless you're putting out a leak that is working in line with some kind of political apparatus, then they don't care. They tend to either bury it, not necessarily care about it. It's not something that's get aired. And I think this hearing is a very good example. It's not that Tulsi was being dishonest. It was the fact that she was revealing. And I don't know how that would have been different than Snowden revealing. I don't get the sense that they would have done anything about anything that Snowden would have came out and said. And so it's like, you guys are committing a crime against us, the American population. And then you are going after Snowden, calling the man treasonous when you are committing crimes against us. I mean, I just find this to be outlandish. And yeah, I agree with you. It is look, whatever issues that I take with Tulsi on this issue of either the drone warfare or the issue of Israel, all things being equal, she is far like headlong better than many of the other people who you would put into that spot. And I would want somebody in that spot who's at the very least somewhat skeptical of these regime change wars, addressing the president and giving him intelligence, as opposed to some of these other people like a John Bolton or some of these other lunatics that might be around Donald Trump. No, I agree with you. I think it's a good thing. What do you think our chances are of getting in on this?
Well, it's very close. It's down to 2 or 3 votes. It's going to be very, very close. But honestly, Trump has the option of a recess appointment as well. He could wait until Congress goes to recess and get her in that way, which he has said he kind of is considering and might just do. So I think there's a very, very good chance that she can get in. But she might get the votes. We'll see. It's down to a couple votes if she can change the minds of a couple senators. But also, if Trump just sneaks her in with a recess appointment, I think she can still get the job. I will say that I think this is reflective of what's going on, is that there is an apparatus in this country that's largely tied in with the private sector, with the foundations that the intelligence agencies have worked with the ultra rich in this country, the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, the DuPonts. There's a book by Carol Quigley, who is the academic mentor of Bill Clinton. He wrote about the Anglo-American establishment of kind of the ultra-rich who have their foundations that tend to lean towards the liberal side of the camp, but are very much regime change, hawkish, war-oriented. The people who created the neocons and now seem to have created the woke left and the mainstream current of the Democratic Party. That layer of American politics, which is very much tied in with the intelligence agencies, but also tied in with the private sector and academia, and now Silicon Valley, which is very much their creation. We talk about Twitter and Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg, and I mean these people are that whole Silicon Valley is largely a creation and outgrowth of this Anglo-American establishment. It has so much power, and it has a particular agenda that is at odds with what most of the military and most of the rich and powerful people in America want. It's interesting. I mean, they are kind of an axis in American politics, and they want certain things that I think a lot of people within the power structure itself, a lot of very wealthy people, a lot of prominent military strategists and others just don't want. They want global instability and chaos because they believe that's the road to creating an ideal world. They also very much are Malthusian. They think there's too many people in the world. We need to drive down the population. They want to bring all things back into balance very much. And they have a particularly managerial view. They kind of want to manage human beings. They kind of want to, control human beings. You hear all these sinister plans from the World Economic Forum about you'll own nothing and be happy about it. You'll live in a pod and eat bugs. I mean, that's the Anglo-American establishment, right? That's the World Economic Forum. That's the Club of Rome. I mean, that's the ultra rich that have their managerial schemes. The Round Table Group was, Cecil Rhodes, the colonizer of Africa. Before Zimbabwe got its independence, it was called Rhodesia after Cecil Rhodes. And Cecil Rhodes, when he died, in his estate, he left a huge amount of money for the creation of what he called a secret society. I mean, we're not talking Illuminati or anything silly here, but it eventually became the Rhodes Scholar Program. The Rhodes Scholar Program, which many of the top people that are neoconservative and regime change oriented have been trained in. Eventually, you had the Round Table Group that was created, which was like the first think tank that led to the New York Council on Foreign Relations. Now we have the Council on Foreign Relations, the CFR. You have the Asia Society funded by the Rockefellers, and you have a whole apparatus that's been created by this section of the American power structure that has views that are at odds with what the bulk of the military and what the bulk of the private sector and the manufacturers and the wealthy people want. And that fight between those two, that kind of defines American politics. And that's what Bill Clinton's mentor, Carol Quigley, wrote about in his very long history book, Tragedy and Hope, and then his much shorter book, The Anglo-American Establishment, where it's that layer versus the bulk. That's how you can define American politics. And during the Cold War, it was the hard right, the John Birch Society and the military folks versus those folks. And then they ultimately created neoconservatism, which was like their kind of compromise that kind of brought in some of the hawkishness that the right wanted, but also took the right out of kind of anti-establishment and libertarian places and took it toward a more mainstream place. So neoconservatism was kind of their way of asserting their dominance during the Cold War. Neoconservatism got played out, and so they pivoted now into this kind of mainstream liberal way of doing things. You know, in the Obama administration and the Biden administration, very much were an incarnation of that. When Biden came into office, he wrote an article for the Council on Foreign Relations, their magazine, Foreign Affairs. And I quoted that article, and I read it because I'm sure Biden didn't actually write it. It was written by his staff, but the article was called "America Must Lead Again," and it was a critique of the Trump administration. And if you read it, it was very blatant. They didn't like that Trump said fake news. Because that discredited mainstream media, and mainstream media is promoting the truth and exposing the dictators and blah 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 blah. It didn't like that that Trump was allowing China to build power plants in African countries, right? That African countries were getting electrification because of China, and that had to be opposed because coal power plant is bad for the environment, and that China is not concerned about climate change the way we are. And that if you looked at it, it was very much in order to defeat climate change, in order to maintain the dominance of Wall Street and London, in order to maintain our narratives and make sure of the dominance of mainstream media, Trump must be repudiated in order to maintain this kind of global system that they refer to as the rules-based global order. In order to maintain that, Trump can't be tolerated. And I think Biden was in that essay very much speaking for the intelligence apparatus. And that's the intelligence apparatus that Edward Snowden saw all the evil things they were doing, violating our constitutional rights. And he saw that and he exposed that and he ran to Russia for protection. And Tulsi Gabbard, she comes out of people in the Pentagon who also saw that and said, look, they're arming al-Qaeda. Right. We're supposed to be fighting al-Qaeda. They're arming al-Qaeda. So she said, no, I'm going to speak out against that. And I think she had support. Tulsi Gabbard wouldn't have spoken out about U.S. foreign policy the way she did as an active duty Pentagon high ranking soldier if she hadn't had support. There were not a lot of people in the brass who supported her. And I think that Tulsi Gabbard represents much bigger than herself. There are sections of the American military. And I think a lot of it is that they're running the numbers. They run the scenarios. Like what happens? The USA goes to war with Russia and China. And what happens? Well, they can pull out all the computer simulations in the world and they see the results of that. And it's not good. And they're not on a mission. And that's what kind of makes the military a little bit different than the intelligence apparatus. These folks in the intelligence agencies, they're on a mission. They have this ideological agenda. We're going to spread freedom around the world, and we're going to stop climate change, and we're going to and the military people are like, look, our job is to run the military. Our job is to maintain American strength. And so they're not committed to some crazy mission. They're just looking at the scenario and they're like, if this plays out, we lose and we lose big. So let's not do this. I remember way back in 2013 when Obama was talking about sending cruise missiles to Syria. I was protesting. We marched from the White House. We were marching around downtown DC, and a woman walked up to our protest. And she shook hands with me, and she said, I just want you to know I'm an Arab translator for the FBI, and I agree with you. And I was like, whoa, I didn't expect that. And she said, I know, I watch CNN and I watch these protests and I can understand what these protesters against Assad are saying. And they're saying, expel the Christians, death to Alawites. And these are bloodthirsty terrorists like who killed us on 9/11. And Obama is absolutely nuts for backing them. So, I'm an FBI Arab translator and I just want you to know, I agree with your protest. Good work. And I was just like, oh, okay. But that was big, that was a big moment. And that showed you, and it wasn't just FBI Arab translators walking up to protests that I witnessed. It was also, there were a number of soldiers who obscured their faces and held up images saying, no war on Syria, don't bomb Syria. And that there was a whole section of the American power structure that disagreed. And, if you want to just play by the standard leftist rules, right? They're all bad, right? And, I'm against the whole system or whatever. But I think we have an opportunity to be strategic here. because part of the reason that Tulsi Gabbard wants a better relationship with Russia is because Russia has been tracking Islamic terrorists and extremists for years. You know, Afghanistan, even going back to World War II, Hitler armed the Chechen Islamic terrorists to fight against the Soviet Union during World War II. So they've been dealing with Chechen Islamic extremists, the Afghan, Osama bin Laden crowds. They've been tracking those people for years. They know how to deal with them. And there's a lot of Muslims in Russia. There are more Muslims in Russia than in any other non-Muslim country. And, you know, so there's a lot of Muslims that are loyal to the Russian government that help them track the extremist Muslims who commit terrorist acts and such. They're really good at tracking Islamic extremism. That's why before the Boston bombing, the Russian government actually came to the American government and they said, hey, these Zarnev brothers, watch them. They're on the internet. We've tracked what they've been doing on the internet. These two Chechen guys whose parents fought against us in Chechnya and were part of this armed group to fight against Russia. And then they moved to the United States. Watch these two guys. They're planning something. The U.S. government didn't listen, and they blew up the Boston Marathon, as we saw, right? And that Russia has very, very good intelligence when it comes to stopping the kind of guys who do ISIS terrorist attacks and bomb and kill people and become Islamic extremists. They know how to catch those guys because they have a very, very sophisticated apparatus. And Tulsi Gabbard, who wants to keep Americans safe, I think she wants the American intelligence agencies to be able to cooperate with the Russian intelligence services to stop Islamic extremism and terrorism. Whereas the Obama school of thought, Brzezinski and Biden, their thinking was, oh, well, we can use these Islamic terrorist networks because they'll overthrow bad guys like Assad or bad guys like Gaddafi. And it's kind of like there's two different agendas here. Are we trying to keep Americans safe, or are we trying to overthrow governments that get in our way? I've been pointing out to people that since the war on terror began, the USA has basically been acting as Al-Qaeda's air force. Wherever there's a government that gets in the way of Al-Qaeda, we overthrow it and Al-Qaeda gets stronger. Saddam Hussein was not a supporter of Al-Qaeda at all. Saddam Hussein was a Ba'athist Arab socialist, a secular leader. USA overthrew his government and Al-Qaeda got stronger. And, you know, in Afghanistan, they destabilized and occupied the country, and Al-Qaeda groups got stronger and prospered, and the heroin trade got going in Afghanistan. Gaddafi, not only was he against Al-Qaeda, he was actually torturing people. He has been fighting Al-Qaeda for years, and he said to the American government, look, I know you guys don't torture. I'll torture people. You want me to, you know, I'll torture Al-Qaeda people. Gaddafi was so opposed to Al-Qaeda, he was torturing people to help the American government fight Al-Qaeda. And the Syrian government, but the U.S. government is so committed to this regime change stuff, and it's more committed to this kind of globalist agenda of destabilizing and overthrowing governments, that the governments that have been targeted have been the terrorist enemies. It's absolutely outrageous. If you want to know what this sinister deep state that we talk about, what they believe, go and read The Aquarian Conspiracy. This is an obscure text that was published in 1981 by Marilyn Ferguson. And Marilyn Ferguson was the psychic guru of Al Gore. She was Al Gore's personal spiritual advisor. And she was funded by the Stanford Research Institute in California. And she wrote this manifesto in 1981 about what she believes. And again, it just sounds like a crazy kind of occultist weird thing about like there's a global awakening happening and we're going to reduce the population and people are raising their consciousness and all this. And it wouldn't matter if this woman wasn't personally advising Al Gore. Al Gore, and if she wasn't like giving classes to all the people that did the computer revolution, right? The Stanford Research Institute is where the U.S. government was funding all the computer revolution research that led to the creation of Silicon Valley. So Marilyn Ferguson, this nutty occult guru who wrote this Aquarian Conspiracy, she writes this manifesto in 1981, basically saying what, you know, this kind of regime change oriented globalist faction of the deep state, what they believe. And you read it and it makes a lot of things make sense, right? That there is a perspective, that a belief that historical progress is bad, that we need to move backward historically, that there's too many people in the world, that we need to manage people, and that we need to create some kind of global spiritual movement that will tear down governments. And you look at it like that's what the intelligence agencies believe. And, you know, we now know about the Stanford Research Institute and what it was doing, the role it played in creating Silicon Valley, and also the role it played in setting up the color revolution apparatus, and the fact that she was advising Al Gore. Right. Al Gore famously said, you know, I invented invented the internet, right? And everyone made fun of him. But what he was referring to was the fact that he worked with the intelligence agencies to funnel the money from the NSA and the CIA and all that to the computer companies to help them set up an IBM and Microsoft and Amazon, and a lot of these big computer corporations in the late 80s were being set up by American government, strategic operations. It wasn't the free market that created these institutions. It was very much an intelligence decision because the Soviets couldn't afford to spend as much money on computer technology. So it was a way to beat the Soviet Union. And Brzezinski actually advocated this strategy as far back as 1970 in his book about the technotronic age and how you could Americanize the world by controlling information technology. And he wrote a whole document about this. As the Vietnam War, as the USA was losing the Vietnam War, he said, look, we got to change our strategy in fighting the communists. We just have to control information. And that information technology, people's relationship with authority, people's relationship with how they view the world is changing because of information technology. And instead of viewing this as a dangerous potential communist revolution, we can actually use this change in the culture, this kind of global cultural shift. We can use this, we can control the information apparatus, and we can use this to overthrow the communist governments around the world. And you read that, and that getting at the center of technological and technology that spreads information, that was the key way to do it. They blatantly spell out what they were doing. And that this apparatus that is tied in with the richest of the rich, that has a very, very long-term geostrategic view, what they have been doing and how they've been running the American government and running the world for the last 20, 30 years since the fall of the Soviet Union, it's had serious consequences. And the rise of Putin in Russia was a repudiation of what those folks did, how they looted the country after the fall of the Soviet Union. The rise of Bolivarianism in Latin America, Venezuela, and Hugo Chavez, and the return to power of the Sandinistas and all that is a repudiation of how these people have run these countries and let Wall Street corporations just loot them economically, et cetera. The rise of the Shia aligned Islamic resistance in the Middle East, Hezbollah and the Houthis and all of that, they are a repudiation of these policies. And the whole world is kind of up in rebellion against the policies that have been advocated by this Eastern establishment and this ultra-rich faction in the United States. And so now we see divisions within the American power structure. And Trump has come into office as somebody who's more friendly to people, maybe like Edward Snowden, maybe like Tulsi Gabbard, who don't go along with them. I think this is a moment there could potentially be a positive shift in U.S. foreign policy. I really, really hope that's the case.
No, I agree with you. We create our monsters. The Stanford Research Institute is fascinating. You see, I know the woo-woo aspect of that. Because, remote viewing was one of the things that came out of Stanford Research Institute in Ingalls Swan. You had this thing where they were talking about this kind of new military of these warrior poets. I mean, it's just a lot of odd stuff that was coming out of Stanford Research Institute. The Men Who Stare at Goats. Again, that movie was related to what they were doing. It's more of the woo-woo stuff in regards to some of the research they were doing. That is fascinating. I didn't know this other aspect of the Stanford research thing. I would look this book up, Bill Crane, Conspiracy, Merle Ferguson, 1981.
It's interesting. That movie, The Men Who Stare at Goats, right? I remember there was a number of Hollywood movies that came out like right as Obama was taking office. And I believe that was from the early years of the Obama administration, where it was like Hollywood and the intelligence agencies, they work together very, very closely and have for quite some time. If you read, there's a book called Finks, How the CIA Tricked the World's Greatest Writers. And it talked about how during the early years of the Cold War, there was at least one CIA asset on the board of every major Hollywood studio. And and it was just really blatant. And when Obama came in, they made a number of movies that were about things that you and I talk about, like COINTELPRO, like MK Ultra and all of that. But it was almost like a limited hangout, right? Where they talk about it in a very limited way. They say if you do something wrong to somebody, right? If you cheat on your spouse, it's better they hear it from you first than hear it from somebody else. You know what I'm saying? And it was kind of like that. It's like, we're going to tell the American people about MK Ultra and Operation Jedi. We're going to tell the American people about COINTELPRO and how the FBI, what they did to Martin Luther King Jr. and all of that. But we're going to tell it on our terms. And all of those movies, they came out And, the J. Edgar Hoover movie that came out made it look
Yep.
like, oh, sure, J. Edgar Hoover did send Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. A message urging him to kill himself. And they did blackmail Dr. Martin Luther King. But that was because J. Edgar Hoover was this weird guy who was secretly a cross-dresser. And, he just had an ego problem. So there we go. Now we talked about it. See, that's what happened. We had this weird guy, J. Edgar Hoover. Don't worry about it, right? And Men Who Stare at Goats, it was like, okay, yeah, the CIA did fund all this money into weird psychic stuff. And, and towards the end, they even allude to the torture that was going on, right? In the end of that movie, I remember. But, that was because there's different people within our intelligence agencies. But look, there's these good guys. There's these nice hippies that are against it. And see, and there was a movie called The Good Shepherd that came out roughly around the same time. And I think
I remember that. Matt Damon, right?
Yeah, Matt Damon. And it was also a similar thing. And it showed them like torturing Soviet guys and giving them LSD and all that. It's like, and showed them overthrowing the Guatemalan government in 1953. And it's like, we'll talk about the bad things that American intelligence has done. We'll talk about them, but we'll talk about them on our terms. We'll make it personal and we'll kind of gloss over the issue. And there, we talked about it. We said we're sorry. We had a Hollywood movie to show you how we did it. And it wasn't really as bad as you might think. And we'll talk about it on our terms. And that's kind of what was happening. That's how I see that movie, The Men Who Stare at Goats, and a number of movies that came out during the early years of the Obama administration. And that was kind of a shift because during the neocon time, during the Bush years, their response was to just laugh all that stuff up. Oh, that's conspiracy theory. You don't possibly believe that. But now with the internet, there's so many people reading about it, they couldn't just deny it. So it was a new approach. We're going to acknowledge some of the bad things we did, but we're going to retell them to make them sound like, it was a mistake. And I also will say that, the wokeification of the United States, right? The fact that like Boeing and General Electric and the top military contractors had like rainbow flags and Black Lives Matter flags. Right. That was all that is very much the intelligence agencies. There's an expression, they say generals fighting the last war. And that's because during the Cold War, the first Cold War, the Soviet Union talked about Black liberation. And they used the Black liberation struggle to just call out the United States. You say you're a democratic country. Here's a picture of Emmett Till's mutilated body. Look what you do to Black people. You're not a democratic country. So they're trying to get ahead of that, right? It's like, okay, they're not going to pull that in the new Cold War. We're going to show that we're not the same old America. We're super very much. And that Black Lives Matter, the slogan Black Lives Matter, became a slogan that was used by the American embassies and intelligence agencies all throughout the Russia-aligned countries. Whenever there was a protest against a Russian-aligned government, the U.S. Embassy would put out, Georgian lives matter, Ukrainian lives matter. I mean, it was almost like they took it on as a brand for building, and it was they know what they're doing is they're trying to get ahead of this, and they don't want the Black freedom struggle in the United States to be a vehicle through which American imperialism is opposed. And you'll notice that at the same time, the Biden administration was, they're painting murals of Angela Davis, and they're, painting the streets of DC to say Black Lives Matter. They also raided the homes of the Uhuru movement and dragged them into federal court because they were a Black liberation organization that was anti-imperialist, that did go to Russia and did meet with Russian folks and did defend Russia in Ukraine. So it shows how they play these games. We are living in very strange times, and we have to just be constantly going back to the drawing board and saying, okay, what's really going on here, and how can we intervene to push the cause of justice and global peace amid all this chaos and craziness.
No, I agree with you, man. I want to play one more clip. This is Gabbard talking about Jake Sullivan. And, because it was this even, and like, I think people need to kind of wrap their head around how astonishing this is. In a congressional hearing, you have a person who's trying to ascend to the position of the Director of National Intelligence, effectively talking about a letter that Hillary Clinton sent saying, I believe it was Jake Sullivan sent to Hillary Clinton effectively saying Al-Qaeda is on our side, or it might have been the other way around. But this is Gabbard entering this into the records, congressional record.
As Jake Sullivan said to Hillary Clinton, quote, Al-Qaeda is on our side in Syria. Well, Syria is now controlled by an Al-Qaeda offshoot. As Jake Sullivan said to Hillary Clinton.
That's astonishing. Like, and again, like, I know I keep going back to this. They can't really, nothing she's saying here is false.
No.
Meaning that's true. again, they don't take issue with the fact of whether it's true or false. They take issue with the fact that she's saying it. And right now, that is in congressional record. She potentially will be the ear, or given basically speaking into Donald Trump's ear. I think that's a positive development, frankly, personally, from my own point of view.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I think it's a very positive development. And I hope that there can be a shift in U.S. foreign policy under Tulsi Gabbard. I'm
sorry to interrupt. The orthodoxy of the U.S., do you see that changing under a Trump administration? I mean, because J.D. Vance has said some similar things. I mean, I think part of the reason that Donald Trump chose Vance is because he also has these kind of, why are we in this war? This isn't doing us any favors. Diplomacy is not necessarily a bad thing. Meaning there is a wing of the Republican Party that seems to be more skeptical of war in a way that it's just not in the Democratic Party. Like, it is astonishing. I had Danny McAdams on the show, and he pointed out, he said in the old days, the Ron Paul Institute used to be able to work with lefties in this kind of left-right coalition against issues of war. He said that is no longer the case. There's nobody on the left that they can work with on this notion of dealing with issues of war and peace. Do you think the orthodoxy on this will change?
Well, I will say it's going to require a mass movement. And I know that that's not something that's generally said on, podcasts like this, but it's true. Ultimately, it requires Americans to get involved. And I will say, when you talk about left, right, and all of that, it's interesting. So Tulsi Gabbard, she is from the Hindu movement, it's a breakaway from the Hare Krishna movement. It's called the Science of Identity Foundation. And her spiritual leader is a guy in California who is a breakaway from Hare Krishna, which is it's a form of Hinduism that is practiced, but they're involved in peace activism going back to the 1960s. They marched against the Vietnam War. The Hare Krishnas were just kind of a regular part of the anti-Vietnam War movement. Very anti-communist, very conservative in India, but also very anti-war. And they were, a religious group that was brought to the United States largely by American intelligence, probably, as an alternative to communism. The idea is young people that are protesting the war, maybe they won't be communists, they'll become conservative Hindus, and they exist and they have intelligence connections. I thought it was also interesting that Tulsi Gabbard shouted out traditional Catholics in her speech, which was very interesting, right? Because the FBI had accused traditional Catholics of potentially being a security risk. And she talked about, now, when we talk about traditional Catholics, these are Catholics who think the Pope is a sellout, who think the Pope is a communist, basically, and they only do the traditional Latin Mass. And they often are very anti-Israel. They feel that, that Israel and its policies are against the United States. And they feel that there's kind of a spiritual war going on between Christianity and Judaism. And, obviously they have views that are not mine. But what I thought was interesting is one of the main intellectuals associated with traditional Catholicism is a guy named E. Michael Jones. And I met E. Michael Jones when I was in the Islamic Republic of Iran. They love him in Iran. The Iranians love E. Michael Jones, and he lives in South Bend, Indiana. He hates Pete Buttigieg, and he is like the big guru of traditional Catholicism, right? And he loves Iran. He supported the Syrian government. He generally takes anti-imperialist stances based on his very conservative traditional Catholic views. And I mean, I don't want to say anti-Semitic. I don't want to hurl labels at people, but he very much believes there's a fight between Christianity and Judaism in the power structure. I don't agree with that, but that's kind of how he sees things as a traditional Catholic. Now, the fact that Tulsi Gabbard gave a shout out to traditional Catholics and how the FBI was targeting them, that says to me that there is an effort to at least some degree to use these kind of different dissident communities as kind of a layer that can give support to Trump if he wants to change U.S. foreign policy. And that's very interesting and exciting to me, right? And we know that, her religious movement had intelligence connections historically, right? In the anti-Vietnam War years, they were used kind of by a section of the American government that wanted to de-escalate and negotiate in Vietnam. They were used to build the peace movement for their own reasons during the 1960s, right? And then she's shouting out traditional Catholics, which, she's shouting them out. And they're a dissident group that is anti-Israel and has a lot of support among like urban cops and firemen. From what I understand, like, urban Catholics of Irish and Polish descent, right? A lot of them are Roman Catholic, but a lot of them, there's a layer, an increasing number of them that get into, conspiracy theories and are questioning Israel and stuff. And so a lot of urban cops and firemen are attracted to this kind of E. Michael Jones traditional Catholicism stuff that makes them critical of Israel and critical of U.S. foreign policy. That says to me that Tulsi Gabbard on some level realizes that if Donald Trump is going to be able to change U.S. foreign policy, there's going to have to be some kind of movement to back him up in doing that, So, historically, I come out of the left, but the left have lost their minds. I mean, I haven't.
Yes.
My beliefs haven't changed. I'm an anti-imperialist. I'm fighting for the working class. I stood with Uhuru when they were indicted, and I went to their court appearances, and I was there at their sentencing. I was there at the opening day of their trial. And that it says to me like there's an understanding that there's going to have to be some kind of mass movement among the population to oppose the march toward World War III. And that's very exciting to me because ultimately, the way Roosevelt was able to, have the United States be on the right side of World War II was because there was a mass movement called the Communist Party, called the labor movement, called the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations. And the way the Civil Rights Act was able to be passed was because Kennedy and Johnson were aligned with a mass movement called the Civil Rights Movement and Martin Luther King Jr. And that ultimately, yes, there's the woke movement on the so-called left that is pro-war and cancel culture and all of that, but there's going to have to be some kind of movement in opposition to it. And I mean, I know about, the Libertarian Party. Angela McCurdle of the Libertarian Party has pushed the Libertarian Party to get more involved in anti-war activism. I consider Angela McCurdle to be a friend. We sponsored the Rage Against the War Machine rally. My organization, the Center for Political Innovation, we were very happy to sponsor the Rage Against the War Machine rally where Tulsi Gabbard was a speaker. And it says to me that Trump and his base know they're going to have some kind of movement to back them up. And that's an important opportunity for those of us who believe in anti-imperialism to build structures that can be in the streets and say, hey, we may not agree with everything Trump does, but if he makes peace with Russia, if he makes peace with North Korea, we're for that. I think that there will be peace with Russia, but Trump wants a photo op. I mean, I think there's going to have to be a big meeting where Donald Trump shakes hands with Putin and shakes hands with Zelensky, and they all take pictures signing an agreement. That's going to be a necessity. Trump, if that doesn't happen, Trump is not for it. So I think that this photo op has to be arranged. I think that the sections of the American intelligence apparatus that are just committed to fighting until the last Ukrainian, they've got to be repudiated. And I think that a meeting between Trump and Putin has to take place, and that can then set the stage for a peace summit. And I think there can be peace in Ukraine, and that will be great if that can happen. I really do think it can happen. But when that's happening, guys like you and me, we've got to be just out there as loud as we possibly can supporting it, because all the Ukrainian opposition folks will be opposed to it. Outside the State Department, there were people with Ukraine flags protesting against Tulsi Gabbard's hearing. I saw them. It absolutely outrageous. Keep killing my people, right? No peace deal. I mean, it's absolutely outrageous. So we've got to push and give the other side of the story. That's my view.
Caleb, man, always appreciate you, my man. Thank you for this. Caleb Maupin, speaker, writer, journalist, political analyst, and author. Caleb, where can people find you, Caleb? By the way, I know it's Center for Political Innovation.
CPIUSA.org. That's where all of our stuff is available. Center for Political Innovation. I also have my own YouTube channel. I'm on YouTube. I stream a lot. I'm on Twitter and stuff. But CPI, that's our group. We had a great reception. The video of your great presentation is up on YouTube already, and it was tremendous. And we're looking forward to doing some great exciting things. We're having a workshop in Minneapolis, February 22nd. That's going to be good. And then we're having our national convention in Chicago in July. So a lot of work is going into that. We want to fill that auditorium up with hundreds of people. So very exciting. So a lot is happening.
Always appreciate you, my man. Thank you for this. Have a good one, man.